This isn't just, dusty history.
No, absolutely not.
It feels more like a roadmap.
Right.
A way to spot and maybe start dismantling some of the intellectual baggage that revolutionary movements have carried, baggage that can really mess up theory and practice.
That's really the heart of it, isn't it? We're digging into this big paradox. You have the Marxist method, the dialectical critique, which is designed to be the sharpest tool, the most uncompromising way to look at the system.
Right. It's supposed to cut through everything.
But then, time and again, when the movement itself tried to use it, something went wrong. It often failed, spectacularly failed, to keep that universal perspective.
It narrowed its focus.
Yeah. And Biel argues, very convincingly, I think, that this failure, this inability to apply the critique equally to the global north and the global south, it allowed this ideological virus, Eurocentrism, to just fester inside the movement, like a time bomb, as he puts it.
A time bomb.
Yeah.
That's a powerful image. And you can see how that would eventually cause huge problems, maybe the worst possible moments.
Exactly. Confusion, strategic blunders, crippling the potential right when it mattered most in the 20th century.
So for you listening, what we're trying to do here is synthesize this pretty complex history, this historiography, to really pin down what left Eurocentrism actually is.
Right.
Especially how it connects or maybe differs from revisionism.
Okay, yeah, that distinction is critical because revisionism, that's more like a conscious softening, right? A deliberate betrayal of core ideas. Like saying revolution isn't necessary, we can just reform things gradually.
Giving up the core tenet.
Right. But left Eurocentrism, Biel argues it's qualitatively different. It often crops up among people who are genuinely revolutionary, totally sincere. It's more like an unconscious blind spot.
A failure in applying the method.
Exactly. A failure to apply dialectics universally. It happens when revolutionaries, even with the best intentions, are sort of blinded by the cultural assumptions, the historical narratives of the imperial core where they often operate.
So they just miss things.
Yeah.
Like the role of the colonies.
They fail to see how the working class in the rich countries, the metropole, is structurally tangled up in the super exploitation of the colonies. They don't connect the dots fully.
So it's not like they're throwing out the whole playbook, but they're only reading certain pages, maybe? Methodological failure.
That's a good way to put it. A methodological blind spot that limits the scope. And the moment that happens, the fight to really strengthen dialectics, to use it properly, is kind of lost.
How so?
Because if you start analyzing the whole world system, if you sideline the economic engine of imperialism, that super exploitation we'll get into, you inevitably slide into other errors. You fall into either mechanical materialism or idealism.
Okay, break those down a bit. Mechanical materialism.
That's seeing history as just this fixed, preset sequence of stages. Feudalism always leads to capitalism, which always leads to socialism, like clockwork.
Which implies every country has to follow the exact same path, the European path.
Exactly. It denies specific histories, specific conditions. And idealism, on the other hand, it kind of floats away from the material base. It starts seeing capitalism's problems as just, bad ideas or maybe greedy individuals rather than baked into the global economic structure.
So fighting Eurocentrism isn't just about being culturally sensitive. It's about maintaining analytical rigor.
Absolutely. It's inseparable from the fight for sharp revolutionary theory and practice. You can't have one without the other. So, to really grasp why the ideology failed, we have to start with the ground floor. The material reality, Eurocentrism isn't just, a bias or some mistaken cultural ideas floating around.
Deeper than that.
Much deeper. It's a systemic reality. It's baked into the structure of the global economy. Capitalism and imperialism are inherently Eurocentric systems because the core, the Euro-American world, fundamentally relies on super exploiting the rest of the planet.
Okay, let's unpack super exploitation. That term is doing a lot of work here. What does it mean in this context? For you listening, this is really central.
It is. Super exploitation basically means that labor power in the periphery, in the global south, is bought and used below its actual value, its social and historical value.
How does that work? How can you pay less than value?
Well, think about what it costs to keep a worker alive and able to work and to raise the next generation of workers. Reproduction, healthcare, education, food, all that. In the periphery, a large part of those costs are often covered outside the wage system.
You mean through things like subsistence farming or relying on extended family, community support, non-capitalist ways of surviving?
Exactly. So capital doesn't have to pay the full cost of maintaining and reproducing that labor power through the wage alone. The worker is subsidizing their own exploitation in a way. This allows capital in the core nations to rake in enormous extra profit. That's the critical economic mechanism.
And that extra profit, drained from the periphery,
Yeah.
that gives the system breathing room back home, doesn't it?
Absolutely. If the working class back in the core countries benefits, even a little bit, even indirectly, from this flow of wealth, well, that profit allows the ruling class in the core to manage its own internal problems, to smooth over the social contradictions.
Buy off sections of the working class, create a labor aristocracy.
Precisely. It provides the material basis for those political divisions we see everywhere. Soften the edges of capitalism at home by grinding people down harder somewhere else.
Which logically means?
It means that the oppressed nations, the places where the super exploitation is most intense, they are the foundation the whole system rests on. And because of that, they are necessarily the main source of revolutionary creativity. The pressure is greatest there, the contradictions are sharpest. That's where the real challenge to the system has to originate.
Okay, so that's the economic base. Hard, material reality. How does the ideology, specifically racism, work to protect that base? How does it function as the superstructure?
Racism isn't just some unfortunate relic or, an absurd set of ideas like some liberals might say. It's the necessary distorted reflection of that economic base. It's a tool. It actively strengthens that racist structure of accumulation.
And justifies it.
It justifies it by completely flipping reality on its head. It falsifies things.
How does that falsification work? Give us an example.
Okay, think about colonialism. Fundamentally, it's violent theft, robbery of land, resources, labor. It's despotism imposed from outside. Now, what does racist ideology do? It takes the effects of that violence, maybe the resistance, the poverty, the social disruption it causes, and paints them as inherent characteristics of the colonized people.
So the colonized are depicted as inherently violent or naturally lazy or incapable of governing themselves.
Exactly. They're mindlessly tyrannical in their own ways, supposedly. So the colonial intervention, the despotism of the colonizer, suddenly looks, well, Biel says it makes the colonial system appear unblemished as a just and necessary world order.
It makes the violence seem like peacekeeping or the theft seem like responsible management.
Precisely. The oppressor claims they're just restraining the inherent savagery or backwardness of the oppressed. It uses the damage caused by the system as the excuse for the system itself. It's a vicious circle.
That's incredibly powerful as a justification. And a core part of this is rewriting history, right? The unilinear myth.
Yes, the idea that history follows one single track, the European track. And this myth essentially removes non-European peoples from history altogether. It denies they had complex societies, political evolution, valid ways of life before Europe showed up, no past, and therefore no viable future without European guidance.
And you can see how that flows directly into economic language we still use, like the concept of underdevelopment.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
That term itself is soaked in this ideology. The very idea of an underdeveloped area implies that the people living there are somehow unfit, inherently incapable of developing their own resources.
So if they can't do it,
Then the master race, the colonizer, has not just a right, but a duty to step in, a civilizing mission to manage those assets properly. It's the intellectual green light for global plunder.
and you find this thinking stated so openly, so brazenly in historical quotes, like Austin Chamberlain calling colonies underdeveloped estates.
Right, like they're just pieces of property waiting for a competent manager. No people, no history, just land and resources.
Or Alfred T. Mahan, the U.S. naval strategist.
Mahan basically laid it out. He said the right of people to control their own land doesn't depend on some natural right, but on their political fitness. And if they're not fit, meaning if they don't run things the way the West wants, then the resources can't be left idle. They have to be utilized for the general good.
The general good meaning the good of the imperial core, presumably.
Of course. Failure to conform justifies taking control. It's the logic of empire.
And this justifies the whole progressive mission of colonialism, civilizing the barbarian. That theme just echoes through the centuries.
It really does. You see it right back in the 1606 patents for colonizing Virginia, the explicit goal to bring the infidels and savages to human civility and settled government.
And it continues right up to the peak of imperialism. Cecil Rhodes.
Rhodes is a classic example. When the Ndebele people resisted British expansion, he didn't see it as legitimate self-defense. He called them the last ruthless power of barbarism and declared that barbarism must pass away. Why? because, as he put it, you cannot stop civilization going into the interior.
The violence is always framed as just friction, the inevitable collateral damage of progress.
Exactly. The invader is never at fault, which is why someone like Aimé Césaire is so vital. He completely flips that script on barbarism.
How did Césaire turn that around?
Césaire looked at the horrific violence of colonialism, the torture, the massacres, the systemic dehumanization, and said, that is the real barbarism. Every act, he argued, causes a universal regression. A poison has been distilled in the veins of Europe.
So the barbarism isn't out there with the colonized.
No. It's what the colonizer becomes in the act of colonizing. The barbarism applies to the crimes committed in the name of civilization. It's the civilizer who descends into savagery, covering up their own moral collapse. That's a crucial anti-colonial insight.
Okay, so that paints a pretty clear picture of the ideology colonialism built. Now we have to turn inward, look at the founders of the movement itself, Marx and Engels. We have to acknowledge, right, they had the tools, the dialectical method to see through all this.
They absolutely did. The potential was there in the method.
But they were also, products of their time, mid-19th century Europeans. And Biel shows their struggle against these built-in Eurocentric limitations was, well, it was ongoing and often incomplete.
Yeah, and it's important for you listening to get this right. This isn't about judging them morally from our standpoint today. It's a scientific critique of how even brilliant thinkers can be hampered by their context. They had the right tools, but sometimes their cultural position, their location, sort of warped how they applied them.
Like the virgin land myth.
That's a key example, the idea that places like North America were essentially empty before Europeans arrived. They sometimes fell into that trap.
Which isn't just an oversight, is it? It's actively erasing entire peoples.
It is. It's an intellectual erasure. Look at Marx's address to Lincoln on behalf of the First International. He praises the white settlers for working the virgin soil of America. His main objection is about slave labor versus free white labor.
He doesn't question the settlers being there in the first place.
Not in that context, no. He overlooks the indigenous populations who were violently kicked off that virgin soil. The failure to even raise the question of the settlers' right to the land, that shows a momentary but significant failure to see the colonial contradiction at the heart of the whole process.
Okay, so that's settler colonies. What about places with huge ancient populations, like India? How did the Eurocentrism show up there?
That was maybe even trickier for them. Marx, especially in his earlier writings on India, often saw the British destruction of the traditional Indian economy, as brutal as it was, as ultimately progressive.
Progressive, how?
Because it was breaking down what he saw as stagnant Asiatic modes of production and forcibly dragging India into the framework of global capitalism. He and Engels absolutely condemned the Brits' motives, the greed, the cruelty, but they also praised the modernizing effects, the railways, the telegraph, the centralized state that colonialism brought, even unintentionally.
So they basically equated Europeanization with necessary historical progress.
Pretty much. It put the whole world on a trajectory defined by Britain's development. That linear thinking, that's the mechanical materialism creeping in again. Seeing history as this inevitable sequence of stages, where colonialism, however nasty, is just the engine pushing things along to the next stage.
Instead of seeing the potential and resistance, maybe.
Right. A truly dialectical approach should have focused more on the revolutionary potential within those societies and their resistance to colonialism, rather than just seeing them as passive objects of historical forces directed from Europe.
This seems connected to that tricky relationship they had with Lewis Morgan's work, Ancient Society. Why were they so excited about Morgan?
Morgan was a huge influence. They were genuinely thrilled because his study of Native American societies, particularly the Iroquois, seemed to offer concrete proof of earlier pre-capitalist forms of communal living, communistic organization in their eyes.
So a historical precedent for the future they wanted.
Exactly. Plus, Morgan was critical of private property and the downsides of capitalist civilization. He seemed to value aspects of these traditional societies, so it looked like a perfect fit.
But there was a catch, a big one.
A huge one. The catch was that Morgan's entire framework was deeply racist. He explicitly believed that historical progress leading up to capitalism and hopefully beyond was propelled by biologically or culturally superior people, specifically the Aryans.
Seriously, he put it in those terms.
Oh, yeah. He saw other societies, like Native American or Polynesian ones, as representing earlier, inferior stages of development that the Aryans had moved beyond. And the critical failure here is what Marx and Engels did with this.
What did they do?
Well, Marx took extensive notes, and Engels later wrote The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, based heavily on Morgan. But in doing so, Engels essentially censored Morgan's racism. He presented Morgan's findings about social structures and property, but quietly omitted the racist engine driving Morgan's theory of progress.
Wait, hang on. They didn't critique the racism. They just left it out.
They left it out. Instead of using their dialectical method to expose the contradiction, how can you praise these societies structurally while also believing the people are inferior? They just presented the parts that fit their argument about property and the state.
Wow. And the consequence of that silence.
It was massive. It left the whole question of race and its connection to class and colonialism theoretically underdeveloped within Marxism for decades. It allowed racists, even pseudoscientific ones, to sort of claim that terrain. It made it much harder later on to properly analyze colonial superexploitation along racial lines because the founders hadn't tackled that contradiction head on. They didn't make colonialism central to their political economy.
Which leads us to how they handled the national question, right? The support for independent struggles was selective.
Very selective, especially early on. Their support for Polish independence, for example, wasn't primarily about Polish self-determination in itself.
It was strategic.
It was strategic for the European Revolution. They saw an independent Poland as crucial for weakening Tsarist Russia, which they viewed as the main reactionary roadblock in Europe. Poland was a means to an end, weakening reaction in Europe.
But they did have that breakthrough moment later with Ireland, didn't they? Recognizing the connection between Ireland and England.
Yes, that was a really significant step forward dialectically. They realized that England's colonial domination of Ireland wasn't just bad for the Irish, it was actually propping up the whole ruling system in England.
How so?
The plunder from Ireland and the political divisions it created, pitting English workers against Irish workers, allowed the English ruling class to maintain control, to sort of bribe or pacify parts of the English working class. It created what they called a cozy, torpid equilibrium. So Irish independence became crucial for disrupting that.
But even then, the framing, the priority was still England's revolution.
Ultimately, yes. Look at how Marx phrased it very clearly. To hasten the social revolution in England is the most important object. The sole means of hastening it is to make Ireland independent.
So Ireland's freedom was still seen mainly as a tool for the English workers' struggle.
It was framed that way, yes. Less as an absolute right of the Irish people and more as a strategic necessity for the revolution in the metropole. The Eurocentric lens hadn't fully cleared.
It seems it was only much later, in Marx's late notes, that we see him really start to challenge the cultural arrogance more directly.
Absolutely. His late ethnological notebooks are fascinating. He's reading all this anthropological stuff, and you can see him actively pushing back against the standard colonial narratives. He started looking at sources that challenged the stagnant Asia idea. He notes, for instance, reading about Emperor Akbar's reign in India, and quotes a source calling Delhi the greatest and finest city then existing in the world at that time. A far cry from stagnation.
And he was quite sharp towards some of the European academics he was reading.
Oh, wonderfully sharp. You can see the dialectical critique in action, turned against cultural prejudice. He calls Sir John Lubbock, a big-name anthropologist, a civilized ass for judging every society based on whether they had male inheritance like Europe.
Civilized ass.
Right. Or that famous bit about the missionary trying to explain to an Australian Aboriginal man about existence without a physical body. The man just couldn't take the missionary seriously. And Marx dryly notes that the more earnest the missionary got, the more ludicrous the whole affair appeared to be.
It's not just funny, though. It's Marx using reason to dismantle that baked-in assumption of European intellectual superiority.
Exactly. He's applying rigorous skepticism to cultural dogma. It shows a real evolution, but sadly, much of this remained in his unpublished notebooks. It didn't fully permeate the movement's mainstream thought at the time.
Okay, so Marx showed glimpses of breaking through these limits, especially late in life. But for a global revolutionary movement, ideas need to be put into practice, institutionalized. And that really brings us to Lenin, doesn't it? He seems like the crucial figure after Marx and Engels.
Lenin is absolutely pivotal, especially in the context of World War I, which just ripped the mask off imperialism, showing its inherent violence and instability. Lenin was the first major Marxist leader to fully grasp the implications of these new conditions.
What was the core shift he introduced?
He fundamentally shifted the focus of the global revolution. He realized it wouldn't be just about, or even mainly about, workers in the rich countries fighting their own bosses. That was the old view.
So what was the new view?
Lenin radically redefined the main struggle. He said it would be a fight of all the colonies, all the dependent countries oppressed by imperialism, fighting against international imperialism itself.
That's a massive strategic change from 19th century European Marxism, putting the colonies front and center.
It's a complete break with the old Eurocentric strategy. He wasn't seeing the colonial struggle as just some helpful sideshow anymore. He saw it as potentially the main event, the primary front line. And crucially, he also broke with that rigid, unilinear view of history that everyone had to follow Europe's path.
How so?
He looked at the revolutions starting to stir in Asia, in the Orient, as they called it then, and said they would undoubtedly display even greater distinctions than the Russian Revolution. He recognized the immense diversity of the world and knew that a cookie-cutter approach wouldn't work. He slammed the dogmatic, Kautskyite textbook formulas and called for real, adaptable, revolutionary dialectics suited to local conditions.
He sounds like he really got it. He saw the limitations of the previous approach. Yet, after he died, the Comintern, the international organization he helped found, seemed to slide backward pretty quickly.
Tragically, yes. Despite Lenin's insights, there's this powerful undertow, this regression back towards what Biel calls tactical Eurocentrism.
Tactical Eurocentrism. What drove that?
Well, think about the context. Post-World War I, Europe was in absolute chaos. Revolution seemed imminent in several countries. There was immense pressure, understandably perhaps, to focus all energy on winning there in the European heartland.
So the immediate crisis overshadowed the long-term global strategy.
It seems so. Even though Lenin's vision centered the periphery, the sheer urgency of the European situation allowed the old assumptions to creep back in. The parties in the metropolitan countries started acting, implicitly or explicitly, as if the whole world revolution still depended solely on them. You see this really clearly in the manifesto of the First Comintern Congress. Trotsky drafted it.
And what did that manifesto say? How did it embody this backward slide?
It basically put the Global South back in a subordinate position. It stated pretty explicitly that the colonial slaves of Africa and Asia would only get their chance for independence after the workers in England and France had seized power.
Wow. So liberation was conditional on European success first.
Yes, and it implied that even after a successful revolution in Europe, the world economy would still be run centrally, presumably from Europe. It denied the independent revolutionary drive and the right to self-determination of the colonized peoples themselves. It was a major step back from Lenin's position.
But this wasn't just an abstract debate, right? There were figures from the colonies within the Comintern pushing back hard against this. People like M.N. Roy and Sultan Geliev.
Absolutely. The debates, especially at the Second Congress, were fierce, though often sidelined later. M.N. Roy, the Indian revolutionary, came at it from political economy. He hammered home the point about colonial super profit.
That extra profit from super exploitation we talked about.
Exactly. Roy argued that this super profit wasn't just some bonus for capitalism, it was its mainstay, its lifeblood in the modern imperialist era. And therefore, he argued, it was impossible for the European workers to actually overthrow the system unless that flow of super profit was cut off first.
So colonial liberation wasn't just morally right. It was strategically necessary for revolution in Europe too.
That was Roy's point. He basically flipped the Comintern Manifesto's logic. He said colonial independence wasn't the result of European revolution, it was the precondition for it. A really crucial insight.
And Sultan Geliev, he took it even further, didn't he? Into more uncomfortable territory for the European comrades.
Geliev, a Tatar Bolshevik, went right to the heart of the power dynamics, including potential racism within the revolutionary movement itself. He didn't just talk about class. He talked about proletarianized nations, the colonies versus the metropolitan nations, including the metropolitan proletariat.
He worried the Russian Revolution might just replicate its own form of dominance.
He feared that great Russian chauvinism could persist, that the non-Russian peoples within the Soviet sphere could continue to be oppressed, even under socialist leadership. He questioned whether a revolution led from the European center would truly liberate the colonized world or just impose a new form of control. His ideas were incredibly explosive because they challenged who should lead the revolution and who really benefited from the global system.
And the response to Geliev.
His ideas were deemed too dangerous. He was arrested in 1923, shortly after raising these points forcefully at the Party Congress. His critique was effectively buried, silenced by the Soviet authorities for decades.
So, with these critical voices Roy sidelined, Galiev's silenced the path was clear for that orthodoxy to take hold.
Yes. The suppression of these debates, the refusal to really grapple with race and nation alongside class, allowed what Biel calls the dead hand of orthodoxy to settle over the Comintern. They fell back on rigid textbook formulas that Kautskyite approach Lenin had warned against. Mechanical stages, dogma divorced from the messy reality of the world.
And you see this reflected in their actual publications.
Starkly. Take the main economics textbook used in the 1930s, Leontief's Political Economy. This was the official guide to understanding capitalism for communists worldwide, out of nearly 300 pages. Guess how much space he dedicated to the enslavement of the colonies, the engine of super profit?
Not much, I'm guessing.
Less than 1 page.
1 page, out of almost 300.
Less than 1 page.
Yeah.
It's just breathtaking neglect. It shows a near total blindness to the economic reality that was actually driving the entire world system Roy had tried to highlight.
That's not just an oversight, that's an ideological catastrophe.
It really was. And this blinkered, Eurocentric worldview meant the Comintern was completely unprepared for how capitalism actually restructured itself after World War II. They were stuck in these old general crisis theories, expecting imminent collapse.
But capitalism didn't collapse then, it boomed. In the West, at least.
Exactly. And it boomed precisely because it found new ways to intensify that super exploitation in the global South through neo-colonialism. New mechanisms of unequal exchange, debt traps, control through international institutions. The official communist movement, stuck in its Eurocentric rep, completely missed this. They couldn't explain the post-war boom in the core, so they mostly just denied it or clung to outdated formulas.
And in the Western parties themselves, this denial took on a particularly patronizing form: social colonialism.
Yeah, you saw this attitude emerge quite strongly. Biel points to the Communist Party of Great Britain, CPGB, as an example. They developed this idea, this doctrine of communist responsibility.
Which sounds noble, but probably wasn't.
It sounds okay on the surface, but it was basically the idea that Britain had to hold on to its colonies even after the war, not to exploit them, oh no, but to guide them, to undo the evil of past imperialism, to ensure a smooth transition to, well, whatever Britain thought was best for them.
It was just colonialism with a supposedly benevolent face.
It was a thin disguise for continued dominance, absolutely. And it was all based on this unspoken, deeply Eurocentric assumption that the British working class, or at least its communist vanguard, was naturally more advanced and therefore had the right and duty to tutor the rest of the world.
Which must have completely poisoned any real international solidarity.
It turned solidarity into paternalism. Tutelage instead of partnership. A complete failure to recognize the agency and revolutionary capacity of the colonized peoples themselves.
So, given this deep-seated Eurocentrism, this structural blindness within the official Orthodox communist movement, especially after Lenin, it seems almost inevitable that the real revolutionary breakthroughs, the real corrective energy, had to come from outside Europe, from the periphery itself.
That's exactly what happened. History has a way of forcing theoretical corrections through struggle. And the single biggest catalyst, the event that really shook the world out of that Eurocentric complacency, was the Chinese Revolution.
Its victory in 1949.
Yes, and the whole process leading up to it and flowing from it. The Chinese Revolution and later the Sino-Soviet split, where China explicitly challenged Soviet revisionism and its related Eurocentric assumptions in the 1960s. That was the jolt the world needed.
How did Mao and the Chinese Communist Party offer that corrective lens?
Well, Mao Zedong, drawing on the experience of the Chinese struggle, offered some incredibly profound anti-Eurocentric insights. Think about his statement on the African-American struggle in 1963. He didn't treat racism as secondary. He said, and this is powerful, the evil system of colonialism and imperialism arose and throve with the enslavement of Negroes and the trade in Negroes, and it will surely come to its end with the complete emancipation of the Black people.
Wow, that directly links the birth and death of the entire system to the fate of Black people. It puts racism and colonialism right at the absolute center.
Right at the core. It moves it from being a special question or a tactical issue, like Marx and Engels sometimes treated it, to being the defining contradiction of the whole capitalist imperialist era. This wasn't just rhetoric. It led to a whole strategic reorientation.
The idea of the global countryside, surrounding the global cities.
Exactly. That concept, articulated most famously in Biel's 1965 article, Long Live the Victory of People's War, declared that the main fight, the principal contradiction in the world at that time, was between the revolutionary peoples of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, the countryside, and the imperialist powers centered in North America and Western Europe, the cities.
It's basically taking their own successful strategy within China and applying it to the whole globe.
It is. And it was strategically essential because it told revolutionary movements inside the cities, inside the imperial core, that the main front line wasn't necessarily where they were. It shattered the illusion that they were destined to lead and direct the global struggle from the center. Leadership was passing to the periphery.
This must have spurred a lot of new thinking, trying to understand the dynamics of this periphery-led struggle.
It absolutely did. The practical success of revolutions and national liberation movements in the Third World forced intellectuals to develop new theoretical tools. This is where you see the rise of dependency theory, with thinkers like Samir Amin being central figures.
And dependency theory tackled that core problem the Comintern had ignored. How does superprofit actually work? How is value drained from south to north?
Exactly. Dependency theorists finally cracked that analytical nut. They showed that global capitalism doesn't just smash pre-capitalist systems, it often preserves and utilizes a non-capitalist sector within the periphery.
That dualism we talked about earlier. The worker relying partly on subsistence farming or family.
Precisely that. This articulation of modes of production, as some called it, this structural dualism, is maintained through things like unequal exchange and trade, through debt, through political manipulation. Because the non-capitalist sector absorbs some of the costs of reproducing labor power, capital can get that labor power for less than its true value.
So the periphery isn't just lagging behind Europe.
No, it's being actively structured into a subordinate relationship. It's not simply undeveloped, it's undergoing the development of underdevelopment, as Andre Gunder Frank famously put it. It's being shaped in a way that blocks its own full capitalist development while ensuring a constant flow of value to the core. Dependency theory provided the economic explanation for what revolutionaries in the South knew from experience.
And alongside this economic analysis, you also had crucial insights coming from radical black thinkers, right? Often seeing things more clearly because they weren't insulated within European assumptions.
Absolutely critical contributions. Thinkers like W.E.B. Du Bois, C.L.R. James, Walter Rodney. Their work was indispensable. They powerfully affirmed the historicity of non-European peoples, directly fighting that racist myth of peoples without history.
They showed these societies had their own complex paths, their own internal dynamics.
Yes, and they showed that the real damage capitalism did wasn't just exploitation, but also homogenization, crushing the incredible diversity of human cultures, the different ways societies had adapted to their environments, and trying to impose a single profit-driven model everywhere.
And their analysis of resistance, particularly slave resistance, really centered the agency of the oppressed, didn't it? Yeah. Cedric Robinson synthesized a lot of this in Black Marxism.
Robinson, drawing heavily on Du Bois and James, made a crucial argument. He said that slavery and racial oppression weren't just tactics or unfortunate side effects of capitalism, they were fundamental to its structure, creating a deep structural alienation. Therefore, the path to liberation wasn't primarily about enlightened white abolitionists or political deals.
It was about the resistance of the enslaved themselves.
Exactly. Their constant struggle, in myriad forms, was the primary force driving towards abolition. It was an assertion of their humanity against a system designed to strip it away. This perspective completely reframes the history, taking it away from Eurocentric narratives and showing that anti-colonial, anti-racist thought isn't an add-on to revolutionary theory. It's absolutely central to it. It is genuine revolutionary practice. #, outro.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, tracing this thread of Eurocentrism from its roots in colonial ideology through the struggles within Marxism and towards the anti-colonial correctives. What does all this history, this critique laid out by Biel, really mean for you, the listener, today?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that anti-colonial thought, anti-Eurocentric analysis isn't optional. It's not just for specialists or people from the global South. It's absolutely essential for anyone serious about fundamental social change.
Why so?
Because if you ignore it, Biel suggests, you almost inevitably fall back into the default position. And that default position, historically, has been social movements being led by, and primarily reflecting the perspective of, The relatively less marginalized segments, often white, often male, often from the imperial core.
Because they're closest to the traditional centers of power in theory.
Exactly. And that default position always, always ends up prioritizing the interests of the metropole, consciously or unconsciously. It fails to see that the emancipation of people in the core is fundamentally tied, structurally tied, to the emancipation of the periphery. You can't have one without the other, not in any lasting way.
And there's a warning there too, right? About how exploitation spreads.
There is. If the most brutal, super exploitative methods used against the most oppressed, most marginalized workers, often racialized people, often women, often migrants, if those methods go unchallenged because they're over there or happening to someone else, eventually capital will try to generalize those methods.
Because they're more profitable.
Because they're cheaper and more profitable. Those savage, flexible, precarious forms of labor discipline that are pioneered on the periphery or in the marginalized sectors of the core, eventually, the system tries to impose them on the broader working class too. We see that happening now.
Which brings us right up to the present day. The 21st century challenge seems to be about understanding this dynamic, this heightened dualism in our globalized world.
Yeah, capitalism today is incredibly sophisticated at exporting risk, dumping uncertainty, ecological damage, and raw misery onto the lower rungs of its global supply chains, onto the places where marginalized workers, often women of color, are concentrated.
Their labor was always treated as disposable, flexible, informal.
Historically, yes. But now that logic of flexibilization, precarity, the gig economy that's being pushed onto everyone, that structural dualism between a core and a periphery hasn't vanished. It's just mutated. It's become more complex, penetrating deep within the core nations themselves, but always hitting the most vulnerable communities hardest and first.
So the final question then, looking forward, is about strategy, about where revolutionary forces should focus their attention and draw their inspiration.
I think that's exactly it. Look, the system is clearly in deep trouble. Multiple crises are converging: economic, ecological, political. Its own logic is driving it towards decay. So the question isn't really if capitalism will collapse under its own weight. The real question is,
What comes next?
right, will revolutionary forces be ready? And crucially, will they be armed with a truly global, truly anti-Eurocentric understanding of history and the present? An understanding that puts the most intensely oppressed and therefore potentially the most creative and revolutionary forces, the peoples of the global south, the marginalized communities within the north, the most excluded, right at the center of the picture.
Not as victims to be saved, but as the primary agents of change.
Precisely. Will we be able to seize the chance to build something new, something based on universal emancipation, before this declining, desperate system drags the whole world down with it? That's the challenge, and meeting it requires constantly sharpening that dialectical critique, fighting Eurocentrism in ourselves and our movements, and truly valuing the revolutionary potential of those whom history has tried hardest to erase.